Okay, I will kick us off. Hello, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening. I know we have Zoom attendees from all over the world with us today. I'm Chris Kelly, founder and CEO of Upwave, an analytics platform for brand marketers. And I'm very excited that we're continuing our Masters of Brand Measurement series with another round of highly credentialed and thoughtful panelists. We love doing these events to bring the measurement and analytics communities together to hear from thought leaders on our industry's most important topics. Now, usually we pick a topic with lots of discussion, lots of noise in the ecosystem, something like OTT or cross-channel video or full funnel measurement, and we summon a great panel to bring clarity to this topic. But this time is different. Today's topic is one we actually feel is under-discussed, so we feel we're bringing it to light. And we feel this because for years, it was a confession I heard from marketers that they would admit in the lobby of a conference, not on stage during their presentation. Or it was something they would whisper at a networking event only after a few drinks, back when, of course, we could gather for things like drinks. And those confessions and those whispers were usually something like, my company is being too short-term oriented, or we're drastically underinvesting in long-term brand building to chase short-term metrics, or I want to spend half my budget on long-term brand building, but pressure from finance makes me spend under 10% on such investments. So I felt for years there was this well-kept secret about short-term pressure on marketers, but then we noticed things started to change. First, we heard from CMOs at great brands like Adidas and Old Navy who would publicly comment that they had been too short-term oriented and they believed their companies had underinvested in long-term brand building. Then actually at our last in-person Masters event in March of last year, during a discussion about cross-channel video, George Musi from Publicis shared some very eye-opening anecdotes about clients feeling the pain for 3 to 5 years after being too short-term focused and underinvesting in long-term goals. Then I traded notes all of last year with Scott from AKQA, who had been thinking about this topic for a while and surfacing data and articles about it. So we're not only thankful to have Scott as one of our great panelists today, but we're very grateful to him for co-conceiving this idea of the panel. And finally, one of those articles Scott came across was a great white paper from McKinsey about bringing a performance attitude to brand investments, in a way, bridging the short-term and long-term divide. So we're very honored to have its author, Kelsey, as one of our panelists today. So all of this felt like it was building towards needing to have this panel topic today. So I could not be more excited for it to begin. So I'll now pass to John Stewart, Upwave's VP of Measurement, to kick things off and introduce our impressive panelists. John, take it away.
Thank you, Chris. As Chris mentioned, I'm John. I run the measurement team here at Upwave, and I'll be moderating the discussion. So first, thanks to everyone for attending. We got a great group of panelists here to offer expertise in this area of measurement, and particularly this idea of short-termism. And so, as Chris mentioned, branding it's in our DNA here at Upwave. In particular, we've been long fans of the Binet and Field study out of the UK that found, and quote, brand building is the main driver of long-term growth, and that without brand strengthening, growth will be weaker, activation will be weaker, pricing power will not improve, and profitability growth will be severely reduced. So we're really excited that we've got a bunch of presenters today who've got a bunch of experience in this area and some who have authored pieces on the topic. And we're going to link up all those works at the end. So without further ado, let's meet our panelists. First, we've got, in no particular order, Scott Simons, Managing Partner at AKQA.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the nod, Chris, and making our conversation sort of a reality here. I'm Scott Simons. I'm the managing partner of AKQA in the media group. I've been with AKQA about 14 years. I think I've been frustrated for a long time with sort of the nod to performance, but that begged the need for something better, better way to measure brand with the fidelity that we got used to in digital and performance. And happy to be a partner of Upwave over the last few years in I think really helping to figure out how to add that performance lens to brand building. And that's really become an area of focus for me. So thanks for inviting me to the panel. Very interested in the topic.
Thank you, Scott. Next, I'd like to introduce Kelsey Robinson, partner at McKinsey.
Yeah, thanks, John. Great to be here. I'm a partner based out of San Francisco, though I joke I've been in my Marin, California office for a long time now. And I lead our growth marketing practice in North America for McKinsey. And I could not be more passionate about this topic. I've been at the firm for about 10 years. And then prior to that, spent a little over 4 years with Digitas in the agency space. And so really excited for today's discussion. And yeah, let's get going.
All right. Thanks, Kelsey. And next up, I'd like to introduce Corey Ross, Consumer Insights at Whirlpool.
Hey, I apologize. It looks like I'm having some video issues, but glad to be able to join. Hopefully I get my video situation here straightened out here shortly. But I've been with Whirlpool about 5 years and looking forward to having this conversation. I know it's a clear topic for us, just given where we sit in a category that's a very long purchase cycle. So it's quite important for us to sort of balance this whole notion of short versus long-term branding.
Awesome. Thanks, Corey. Next, I'd like to introduce Margot Artin, Media Insights at Vox Media.
Hello. Thank you also for having me part of this panel. I'm super excited for this discussion. As John said, I head up Media Insights at Vox, so I oversee analytics and ad effectiveness, and I do feel like this comes up a lot where there's kind of a discrepancy between long-term and short-term goals. Prior to being at Vox, I ran ad effectiveness at BuzzFeed, and prior to that, I worked on the agency side for a number of years.
Thanks, Margot. And last but not least, John Lopes, Data and Analysis at Digitas.
Hello, hello. Hi, I'm John Lopes. I lead our data and analysis efforts for Digitas in Chicago. And that's where I'm joining you from today. Bitter cold and snowing in Chicago. Gotta love it. I started my career in the Boston office with Kelsey at Digitas. So it's good to cross paths again with fellow colleagues. I've worked across a variety of brands and industries, whether it be financial, CPG, consumer durables, retail. And what's common across all of those is this constant tension between short-term performance and long-term brand building. So let's get this party started. Excited to dig in, John.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone, and let's just dive into it. So we've got a nice warm-up question for the group here, and one of the things I want to start with is the study that I referenced earlier that talks about a optimal sort of 60-40 brand building versus sales activation split. But Scott, I want to hear from you. What are you actually hearing from CMOs about, their view on this topic?
Yeah, so I think, I think it starts by sort of a split for established CMOs and established brands versus new CMOs and new brands. But to your point, as Chris said, the banana field sort of establishes that actually marketing effectiveness had declined sort of from the 2012 to 2016 period. Their study was in 2018, but I sort of looked at that 5-year period, which is kind of shocking because we got all these great new channels. We got search, we got commerce, we have remarketing, we have audience targeting, and yet somehow performance got less effective. And I think that's because we actually got distracted with all these new meta metrics that took us off the long-term horizon of growth and sort of focused on these short-term things that don't correlate to growth. So, now when you talk to CMOs, every CMO knows about the banana field study. Everybody knows about this. And to Chris's point, we learned that Old Navy and Adidas, had the sort of the guts to go out there and say that, yeah, we need to return to brand building. But still, even there's a work study, I think it was only about 6 months ago, and we reference it in an article, but CMOs acknowledge there's a short-termism problem in thinking, but when asked how are they moving their budgets next quarter, they said they're moving more into performance and away from brand still. So we haven't supplied the tool set or the awareness or whatever it takes to get across, to get even experienced CMOs. How do we get that? Is the CFO pressure too great? Is the tool set too weak? Is the need for patience too challenging? I don't know what it is, but that's part of what we need to solve. And then the next side is less experienced. Randall Rothenberg had a tweet over the weekend saying that only the top 200 brands ever really advertised on TV. Using TV as sort of a brand proxy, and it doesn't have to be, but it kind of tends to be. So you have 200 brands that are big enough to advertise on TV regularly, but you have 10 million brands advertising on Facebook. So we have a little bit of a gap of 10 million minus 200 of people that need to figure out brand building as they move upwards from sort of direct to consumer and digital and performance based. So there's both a reintroduction of brand for the experienced and a first time introduction of brand for the newly minted brand and product advertisers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, we run into a lot of marketers that, are maybe pure play TV and they just believe that it works, right? So then it's sort of ironic there's a lack of measurement for those guys. So Margot, maybe wanted to hear your perspective on this topic, maybe from a little bit different, sort of the opposite end, the media side.
So I think it's clear that the CMO role has expanded significantly over the past 2 decades, and they're no longer in charge of just marketing spend. Like in a lot of cases, they're running strategy and data and growth programs. And I think that while many things that Benet and Field speak of from the early 2000s still apply, we're in a different world right now with the pandemic. And we need to recognize the vast changes in consumption behavior and the way that consumers connect with the brand during such an event. So I think some of that 60-40 needs to change as the world is going through such a drastic change. I don't think there's like a one size fit all marketing spend anymore, as whole industries are upended with what's going on. There's a lot going towards small and local businesses, right? There's just a new world that we are thinking about. And so building that brand, I think, is more important than ever now. And as a business and as brands, people need to start saying, what does my category look like now during the pandemic? And what is it going to look like in the near future? And how are my consumers changing? And so how do I get my name out there to continue to work with that change?
Yeah, and that's so true. And so maybe with all of these challenges out there, let's explore a little bit that if some marketers are a little bit too short-term oriented, what's the cause, right? Is it simply pressure from the CFO, from investors? Is it perceived outcome or perceived shortcomings and the ability to measure? So, Kelsey, let's start with you and see if if you've got some ideas on this topic.
Yeah, I'd say it's D, all of the above. I think absolutely. I think we'll probably get into the relationship with the CFO and the kind of broader executive team today. We should talk through that. But I think if we all reflect on this panel and probably a lot of our panelists over the last probably 10, 15 years of our career, right? There's been a great revolution in marketing, and we're all in the middle of that, and it's amazing, right? It combined with that, consumers have shifted to digital and direct to consumer in an incredible way, right? And then lastly, our ability to measure demand capture, what I would call more demand capture, marketing capabilities has become like incredibly scientific, right? And really fun to kind of put a bunch of data against and optimize the crap out of it, right? Like that has been like those seismic shifts, I think, have been incredibly rewarding and very exciting for marketers. At the same time, that's combined with we've done some research with CEOs, and over 80% of CEOs look at marketing as a top growth driver. And so if that's the case, and where I'm able to measure in real time with the most specificity and granularity is more demand capture tactics, largely speaking, we all know there's ability to measure brand, right? And I think that's the challenge. Those things I think have come together in a way that has created this real over rotation, right? I can measure, I can show the value, and my executive team expects this of me. And so there's just kind of like in my mind, a little bit of this kind of continuous cycle towards that part of the spend and that part of the buy.
Yeah, absolutely. So Scott, you mentioned a little, you talked, yeah, I think you scratched the surface a little bit about this and, in the last bit. What are your opinions on, some of the root causes or reasons why, some short-termism might be a problem?
Yeah, I mean, Kelsey got it exactly right with both all of the above, and that there are all these new tools and new channels that really do have great efficacy. So that isn't the problem. I think the issue is mixed in with the real efficacy and the real science and the real some deterministic data is sort of this perception of this perfect fake authority of deterministic data that comes from everything click tracked. And so you have all of this data, and effectively that sort of steals a lot of everything else out there. If you're going to establish brand with PR and word of mouth and distribution, those are enormous contributors. And sort of, to call a brand search or a remarketing click the causal entity for something happening is just not true. So, I think there's a lot of belief and a lot of credit go into those things. And then people start reorganizing their entire departments around that. They put someone in charge of paid search and then branded paid search and then remarketing and then something else. And then they sort of pit them against each other and say, who's going to win the ROI challenge? Oh, remarketing won again. That's just not how marketing works, but that's how I think naive, digital obsessed groups have started to organize themselves. So, back to your question, that's the problem. So what's the answer? The answer is kind of the hard work of going back to having a little patience, maybe getting the pinch that your publicist person said, that they started to see the 3 to 5 years of decline when they've gone performance too long. And there's been great examples of that even in private equity. They bought 3G bought Heinz, and they lost 18 billion in market cap, 33% of market cap, because they reduced not just marketing, but R&D and all the other investments in the brand that created this forward-looking perspective. So I think the hard part is disabusing yourself of the addiction of these digital metrics, believing that clicks and click rates and visits are the answer, and sort of getting back to brand marketing. It's funny, I don't know why it begs the best titles in the world, but in 2008, ComScore wrote Natural Born Clickers, showing that click did not correlate to quality. In fact, it was the opposite. And that was 12 years ago, 13 years ago. I think it was last year or 2019 that the UK IAB wrote Don't Be a Clickhead as a study too, showing that 10 years had passed and we were still addicted to this. So the addiction to click metrics and sort of false deterministic performance stuff is very real. So the hard part, again, is the patience and what are the new tool sets. So not want to Upwave and your competitors are the ones bringing in this new higher fidelity look at audiences, at audience verification, at alignment of messaging to audiences. And that's part of what attracted me to Kelsey's report too, from McKinsey on performance branding. I think we actually do have a tool set to add more fidelity to audiences and brand exposure that starts to match the addiction to the lower funnel sort of metrics we have. So maybe we can just fall in love with the brand metrics as much as we do with sort of the performance metrics, and look at the full spectrum as a way to go forward.
Yeah, I love the reference to the Natural Born Clickers study. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is this idea that, brands, they want engagement. That's great. But it's a little too tempting to then take data signals as proxies for that engagement because they're available and they're there. When maybe there's a disconnect between what you really want and what is actually easy to measure. I think it's spot on when you say you got to do the hard work. Margot, you're probably on the receiving end of this sometimes. What's your experience with some of the sources or root causes of short-termism?
I definitely, I think it's all of the above, like everybody else has been saying, right? It's pressure from the CFO and shareholders demanding value and KPIs from their internal organization. And again, I agree. It's easy to look at the now and the money that's coming in and the low-hanging metrics. So, regardless of what somebody's business KPI is, there's a lot of times where they are just looking at CTR or VCR and without knowing what those really drive to, and it can be very specific to the type of advertising that you're putting out, where those metrics may or may not mean something, right? So when you're thinking about branded content, a CTR doesn't necessarily make sense, but does a view through rate make sense? It only depends on where the brand is coming in and how the brand is shining, right? So every creative and every asset is very different in terms of what metrics we should be looking at. And instead, everybody's looking at it overall and holistically. And I think that, that creates a problem. And something else I kind of wanted to bring up was that, yes, while making money is at the heart of any business, I do think that distribution has taken a front seat. So, many digital platforms are now taking the place of brands. So brands do need to get out there and advertise. When you think of toaster brands, you're going to look for a toaster, but you're going to go to Amazon or Best Buy, and it's a place that offers you 5,000 toasters, right? So they're ranked and sorted, and they're all priced to your specifications, right? So while distribution deals are critical for success, the point at which your brand comes into play is what really matters. Are you going to be at the top of that list because you are branding? And that doesn't come down to a CTR of every program that you do. It's how are you driving that ad effectiveness of your upper brand, or else you're allowing the platforms to drive your brand and tell consumers the name of the toaster that you should be getting, not because you value that brand itself.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this is sort of an older problem in technology. The worst thing for a premium, laptop maker is the row of 100 at Best Buy lined up, where, the temptation is to pick the cheapest one. And so how do you stand out?
John,
So-
may I add real quick, one of the root causes, and we've kind of danced around this a little bit, is the obsession with speed. Like, think about the world we live in right now, where we get an Uber, we know how quickly it's coming to our house. We're ordering lunch, we can tell how quickly it's coming and when we're going to get it. So I think there's also, that's permeated into our professional behavior as well, where I think there's been a premium placed on speed and speed of results, and perhaps not enough critique of if that speed of insight truly is scalable and has the fidelity that we need. So I just want to add that into the mix here as we kind of go through some of these root causes.
Yeah, I would just add, based on, I think the new reality also is that the consumer will see the endless row of toasters or the endless row of laptops. And if you don't have brand distinction, then you're going to have to battle it out on the performance level there. And that will be increasingly costly to do that, and to do it new every time. That is the Benet Field sort of step ladder of making sure your brand awareness and favorability and your mental availability is strong, so that when you need less physical availability, or you need to pay for less physical availability to make the final purchase. So, I do think, I think we need to see that Amazon solution, or that endless row of instant availability, as a driver of brand, not as a driver of performance need.
That's a great segue, I think, into kind of moving on. We've talked about some of the causes and reasons, and what about the repercussions that, could be long-term? So, Kelsey, let's maybe head back to you and see what your thoughts are on brand health long-term, and what that could mean for marketers that focus a little bit too much on the short term.
Yeah, and I think, I think Scott hit on a couple of these too. I think the repercussions have been quantified in some cases, right? Example cases of, long-term, and the unfortunate point to Jonathan's point is these are cases, spelled out in the 4 to 5 year timeframes, which, that's good patience you need there. But I think, case studies of companies that may have underinvested, I think a lot of our clients are seeing it as, as they try to put more and more money into some of these more kind of demand capture performance marketing channels, they're also seeing a degradation of results because they haven't invested in the upper funnel, and they can actually now launch again longitudinally, maybe in the scope of even less than 4 or 5 years, see that, hey, like this isn't a viable path forward. So I think the marketers are starting to see that just in terms of the actual return profile and the effectiveness of their channels. I think, some of the insights we found through some of the research we did and the performance branding piece too, was some of the implications are like less budget and more consternation with the CFO, right? And so, about 45% of CFOs in some of the research we did said, they had declined marketing investments because they couldn't link it to value. Like that was the CFO's perspective, right? So I think the other implication is, not keeping up with required budget to be competitive, to build that brand, because we're not speaking the same language about why the kind of mid and upper funnel investments are actually really necessary. So anyway, those are a couple of repercussions we're seeing.
I think just to maybe chime in, I think one of the main concerns with sort of that pullback in terms of the long-term brand building aspects is sometimes I think it gets missed in terms of the ability to drive pricing power. And probably the biggest fear that all companies will have, particularly those who have brands, is commoditization. And so I think having a clear view of sort of the idea of why we have brands, what role it plays to help fuel some of the things that we're trying to drive in terms of driving certain pricing power or be able to have that strong merch activity. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. All those sort of things are working together, but it starts with obviously a clear understanding of the consumer, but also understanding, are you in a good, solid position from a brand standpoint so that you are able to sort of be able to do the certain things you're aiming to do in a much more efficient way.
And I think, while it does take longer term to sort of make sure you're accumulating that awareness and favorability, I mean, if you want to replace the geekery of sort of the day trading of performance media, that's where the more real-time data of something like an Upwave, where you can, is this my target audience? Is my media reaching my target audience? Is my message resonating the way I think it should with my target audience? Should I segment men and women, loyalists, non-loyalists? It doesn't have to be this nth level deterministic targeting, but maybe if you need some weekly data to feed to the CFO to make sure that they know that you're tracking this as granularly as sort of your performance, that can be sort of the answer. You still need to make the payday later, but I totally agree with you, Corey. You need that preference to hold the pricing power, to understand the product, so that again, so you don't get to that place where you're dropped as a commodity into a raft of 100 other choices similar to yours, but lacking the ability to differentiate at that point.
I think what I've at least seen historically in past lives is that what tends to draw attention is the inability for certain like merch activities to drive the type of sales that they used to be able to drive. And so that tends to get a lot more attention because of the level of investment that's oftentimes put into merch activities. And so I think that's, being able to quantify sort of over time, because Kelsey may have been saying is, you see that begin to sort of deteriorate. And I think that's what we've seen with a lot of companies is, trying to sort of cut back and then find out over time that, those same activities in terms of some special or promotion that they had isn't driving the same type of response that it used to. And so that goes back to you working off a very weak base in which to sort of have those campaigns or activities sort of help boost your business in the short term.
Yeah, and Corey, I'm glad you're on the panel here. So we have this brand perspective. We've talked so far a lot about lower consideration purchases, right? Like toasters and whatnot, and the challenges there. But, you know, Whirlpool, with what I would consider to be a very strong brand, have potentially have products that are longer in their purchase cycle. And, you know, in some cases, maybe longer purchase cycle than could outlast a marketing organization or a CMO, right? So how do you balance the, you know, this idea that short-term brand performance is an imperative, you know, in this case, but, you know, there's the purchase cycle might outlast everybody. So, you know, how do you navigate this, or how do you think about this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, it probably pretty consistently you'll hear is there's a balance. I mean, that balance is probably going to be driven by sort of the strategic priorities, you know, for that given year. I mean, there's always a lot of activity happening in terms of new innovations and things like that. And so, you know, there is this sort of aspect of, hey, we got to maintain a level of engagement and sort of awareness and connection with consumers, but also, hey, we got these new things that we're launching that we need to make sure drive the level of attention and at least getting traction in the marketplace. And so there is sort of always this healthy tension, I think, in terms of making sure that sort of the whole entire sort of decision journey or ownership experience is sort of all baked into our plans, and making sure that we're sort of addressing all those points so that it isn't necessarily going too far to the extreme, one or the other. But, you know, like I said, it's heavily going to be dependent on, in our particular case, a lot of times of sort of what are the priorities for the year and staying committed to those priorities.
Yep. So John, you know, I'm sure that you work with a number of brands that face this similar challenge,
including Corey.
Yeah.
Full disclosure here.
Yeah. His pain is my pain. So
that's right. That's right.
That's great. We're all in the family here. What, what's your perspective, you know, maybe from working with Corey or others?
Yeah, I think mindset is critical. So going on, let's call it education tours and sharing the research internally within the organization, I think has been really effective to make sure that we're all sort of working from the same base of knowledge to then assert these ideas that we have about long-term brand building. So I think that's been absolutely critical. I think one area that we've started to build some intelligence around is, you know, using techniques and proven techniques like marketing mix models, and not just using the outcome metric as sales, like trying to include brand equity measures, maybe considerations, sort of some of these longer term indicators of brand growth within those models. So that way you can really understand the balance of, all right, this is what drives my business in the short term. Here's some strategies that I could optimize or even maybe create simulations for to drive that longer term effect. So I think that's been, you know, just a sampling of the few things that I think we've done together that's worked. And I would just say lastly, just in terms of performance measurement, making sure that you have a strong understanding of that consumer decision journey. And at each stage, you have metrics and an analysis to understand where your brand is stacking up versus others. So like pick apart that journey, even if it is 9 years long, you can find ways to sort of parse out audiences across that journey and then really understand where you are at each stage. I think that has been enlightening for us as well.
Thanks, John. And it just dawned on me that we've obviously got a panel of everybody's passionate here about branding. And so, you know, maybe we are lacking the opposite or the alternative, you know, idea. So maybe Kelsey, you can help us. Was there like, what maybe was the most surprising finding from the McKinsey study? You know, that might not be completely aligned with what we've been talking about so far.
I think a lot of it was aligned. Yeah, you know, I mean, maybe so two things, maybe to your question, not necessarily some of the research we did, to your questions. I mean, yeah, I think we would all, I assume we'd all nod and completely appreciate the role of demand capture, performance marketing, day trading, all of the things that we have all grown up in this sector, in this industry, knowing and learning how to do and doing for our clients or our companies. Like, I think this conversation is not to say those things aren't important. I think this conversation is to say those things in a vacuum shall not create a sustainable business for you, right? And not create sustainable customer relationships, client relationships, consumer relationships for you. So, I mean, I think hopefully we're all kind of aligned there. Maybe we're not playing devil's advocate enough is what you're telling us, John. You know, I think a couple other things that we found in our research was, you know, marketers actually, you know, whether they're following a 60-40 rule, believe that's a silver bullet, we'll leave that aside, we kind of covered that, but there are, you know, marketers are spending, they're still spending on mid and upper funnel, right? They're still spending on some of these more demand generation, brand building tactics, but they just aren't, like, somehow the ability, again, to translate that into value, which is where we're starting to go, hasn't happened yet. And I'd say maybe one thing that was surprising that underscored the need for this kind of conversation was, especially amidst COVID, there is a real disruption happening with most companies' consumer bases. And what I mean by that is, you know, we're doing separate research and we found over 3/4 of consumers have changed how they shop. They've changed the brands, the retailers, the way they shop. And so that was happening. But at the same time, about 40% of CFOs were telling us we don't think that we should protect marketing investments of certain types during a downturn. And so there was this interesting duality last year, and even now still, I think that, and I'm sure, you know, the others on the panel will have some perspectives where it was, you know, maybe not an appetite to actually protect some of the things we're talking about, and yet a real need to, because the shakeup that's happening in terms of loyalty disruption is kind of, you know, unprecedented, right? So that insight actually is what really drove us to do some more research and write the article.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring it back to the performance side a little bit too. Also, I don't want this to be esoteric and pretend that this hasn't been solved. You know, I think we're solving it regularly. I think investing in brand, you know, in brand growth, new audiences, new market penetration, new household penetration, making sure you're tracking that using a technology platform like Upwave, correlating that through a media mix model to increase brand search, increase visits, increase purchase, increase sales at, you know, at store and trade. We're doing it, and we're proving that we can use digital to be more effective than TV, using some of the performance brand techniques that Kelsey has talked about. It's not that TV doesn't work, it's just I believe that digital gives us flexibility if used correctly. So to the question of, is this possible or can it be solved? Yeah, it could and should be done. And I think this is, you know, that's the idea of this panel, is that if you're thoughtful and deliberate about growing your brand, if you understand your audience, but willing to test into the fidelity of how to talk there without over complicating and making your audiences smaller or less effective, that does correlate and push to the performance side. And ideally, you'd like your marketing to be a business lever where you can grow demand when you can afford it and harvest the demand when you need it at end of quarter or in a period of crunch or something like that. So that's the idea of having this more complete tool set where you can pull the levers on brand, just as we, you know, I think we all believe we can pull the levers on performance. Okay, let's go heavy on brand search because that helps us deliver our revenue right now, or let's double remarketing for this period. We know those levers, but how do we get as adept at building audience and building demand when we can afford to do that? And I'm trying to say that the tool sets are there. The important part is getting the organization to sort of align on that and to start that level of learning.
Just to chime in real quick, I think one of the things that I've definitely tried to reemphasize is the fact that you can't treat marketing like it's a flip of the switch and, you know, money just starts flowing as soon as you turn on media or invest in marketing activities. There is a price to be paid when you cut back, and it may not necessarily be immediate, but, you know, we try to educate our business partners or stakeholders or leadership around sort of the potential impacts associated with, hey, we have to cut back this quarter or the next 6 months. Just recognize that, you know, when you turn it back on, you should not expect immediately sales is the return back is normal. You have to spend time in investing and kind of rebuilding sort of back that base. So I think that's one of the things that we sort of try to emphasize in terms of sort of that short-term thinking versus long-term impacts.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we've also got some great questions from the audience, a little bit more around the funnel, which we'll get to. But first, it's prediction time. What do you guys think are going to be some of the biggest trends in media measurement for 2021? John, let's start with you.
Let's shake up the crystal ball. What do we got in there? Yeah, I think, look, the biggest thing for 2021, I think preparation for all of the changing data privacy and policy regulations, right? So I think a lot of brands will be focused on that. For example, standing up clean rooms, for example, Ads Data Hub, et cetera, and the like. I do think that we will see more diversity and inclusion-based metrics. I know this isn't squarely in line with what we're talking about today, but if you just think about media trends in general, I think what we saw over the past year is holding us all more accountable for those types of metrics. The Gina Davis Institute is a great resource for that. And others, of course, you can go check it out. So I do think that's going to be play a greater role in keeping brands accountable for being representative of society at large. And I would say those are going to be the two biggest things: building up identity graphs, clean rooms, and then holding brands more accountable for diversity and inclusion oriented metrics.
You know, you bring up a great point around, you know, some of the challenges in measurement. And in fact, this year, the way of measuring sort of got turned upside down with Apple and Google's planned moves away from cookies and device IDs. Do you guys think that these traditional, more short-term models like MTA or path to conversion will just completely break? Do you guys invest in rebuilding these types of models right away? Do you wait until the dust settles? What are some thoughts around that? A bit more tactical.
I'll quickly jump in on that one, John. I would say I'm actually looking forward to cookies going away, because I think we need a better infrastructure for long-term measurement. You know, like what we've talked about so far is like, how do you prove that demand generation or brand building will ultimately then create a business impact for you? And in order to do that, you need some sort of identifier or currency that you can track over, I mean, for Corey, over a 9-year period. So I think I'm looking forward to the next generation of identifiers, because I think that's going to actually put us in a much better position to answer some of these questions about balancing long and short term. In terms of whether MTA goes away or whether you should continue to invest it, I like to think that you should be going forward and exploring these new techniques in identity infrastructures. I think, you know, you got to get in there now. There is a first mover advantage. And so I would say, yeah, jump on in.
I'd love to just comment on that too. Like, agreed with the demise of the third-party cookie. I do think our predictive models are going to be much harder to come by. That doesn't mean they're going to go away, but it's going to be difficult. And it becomes very important to understand the journey of the consumer and the way that they use media for longer purchase cycles, right? And so understanding the media mindset and how I might say use Pinterest, or what I'm feeling when I'm watching a TV show, or how I'm connecting, it's going to become a critical component on the types of media that I place in the platforms that I invest in. And specifically, that's going to happen with things that have a longer purchase cycle.
Thanks, Margot. That, yeah, that's spot on. Okay, well, we've got we've got about 10 minutes left. And so we've got some questions queued up that I think are really interesting. So let's go with the first one. I'll just throw these out to the group. So, jump in if you've got some perspective. Okay, we've got one here. For brands that have a more mature marketing engine, what advice would you have for brands that have great awareness, great consideration, but are losing momentum maybe a little bit mid or further down the funnel in those stages? How do you guys think about how, these brands can best allocate effort to improve further down the purchase journey?
Yeah, I think I'll just chime in. I think one of the things we definitely have to make sure you understand is sort of what's sort of playing out during that sort of purchase decision journey that they're specifically kind of dealing with within their categories. I think Whirlpool, we've understood that having a better understanding from start to finish, from the moment someone decides that, hey, they want to buy an appliance, to sort of the research process, to all the way to the purchase, you got to know sort of those dynamics and sort of curate not only your content, but also understanding where to place your content and sort of those touch points. So I do think it's really getting under the hood and understanding sort of all the sort of nuanced things that happen throughout that experience, so that you're better equipped to sort of create the experience to sort of fit the needs of that specific shopper as they're going through the decision process.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly right. That's where you connect your brand marketing to your experience analytics. And ideally, if someone is past awareness to have any touch with your brand, have you seen them consume certain content on your site? How can you correlate that to consideration, and how you can, sequence the messaging so you push them to that next stage? Typically, if you have that robust a stage where you can see that they're falling apart in consideration, hopefully you have a long enough term relationship with the client or potential customer to sort of make that experience analytics push back into your marketing. That's also where I think thinking in terms of a holistic experience between the interaction with your site or brand and any touch point that you can measure gets fed into the decision journey that you're building for your brand campaign.
I think just building on that, like, how do you disaggregate consideration? Like I think kind of where Corey and Scott are both going too, around, okay, we're not winning consideration. Maybe we've got awareness, we're not winning consideration. Well, what are we not winning? What is it important to move? And how can I translate that? I think one thing I'm really excited about is how can we translate something that feels nebulous, like consideration, into like more concrete, actions, like you were just saying, Scott and Corey, actions we want the customer to take, things we want to see. Doesn't have to be a purchase, especially not, Corey, in your world. But I can also unleash the great performance marketers I have on trying to drive those actions too, right? And actually then giving those as goals and kind of charges to the team. But you kind of have to bring it down to earth, right? And that takes a little bit of studying what consideration means, and then actually putting those as goals for outcomes, right?
Yeah, and I think this tees up a question that we face probably every day, which is, if you're thinking about these upper funnel metrics, how can we tie, or is it even important to correlate them with some of these lower funnel metrics? I think we've all sort of said, hey, you've got to keep awareness consideration levels high. You got to monitor and measure these things and drive toward those KPIs. But I still have to answer that question of sales, right? Or actions taken, or, revenue. Is it important to tie these things together? Or, if it is, like, what tactically, what can be done?
Well, I think part of I think what Jonathan was saying too is, skipping. Let's worry. Clicks and shares, they don't matter, right? Let's correlate these events to business results that we want. I mean, the clicks and visits can be interesting midpoint journeys, but one of the good things that could come of cookie deprecation and lack of this overwhelming digital data is we might move back upstream a little bit more and do more media mix modeling, more correlation analyses over time to correlate impressions and audiences and activities and business outcomes that we want, and get a little bit less focused on the noise of the digital counting in the middle.
Yep. Okay. I have a really interesting question here that we may not know the answer to, but I think let's say we've convinced everybody in the audience brand building is the most important activity. Go out, measure brand, spend money on brand. It's very expensive. Typically, it can be, orders of magnitude more expensive than direct response advertising. What would be a common or typical sort of percentage of revenue that you would ideally spend on marketing, and in particular brand marketing? Any rules of thumb here? Any guidance? If not, we're gonna do some. Somebody has sparked some original research.
No, you can't do category research. I mean, there are, CPGs can spend 10% of their total revenue on marketing, and they publish those things. I think your point is well taken, though. I think it is hard to take that leap to this next big spend level that has a longer term maturation cycle. So that remains, something that's dependent on an academic belief that marketing will help your business grow, and setting the right measurement frameworks in place to capture that, and having the patience. Like I say, if you're addicted to the near term trade mentality, then you can get in and look at the detail and the fidelity of brand marketing in a way that wasn't possible before now a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I always think those benchmarks are a little dangerous. Maybe that's a little bit why there's some hesitation across the panel too, is because every time one of our clients asks for them, there's really not a silver bullet answer. And let's talk about where your brand is at, where your company's at. And you can say it's 7 or 15, and unless we talk about what's underneath that, it's kind of a fool's errand, right? So that might be the unpopular response, but I think it's probably one that resonates with the panelists, as I see Hot nodding. And then I think so that's one. And then I think one thing that we had a client last year amidst 2020 that was actually in the sector of kind of employment, right? So job listings, that kind of stuff, like job marketplace type. And a kind of quick piece of work we did with them was actually just to pilot and prove, like, how can you bite off like an experiment that shows to your organization that, if we spend into brand, here's the kind of downstream effects it has in terms of the traffic we get, in terms of the visibility we have, in terms of the efficiency from some of our channels. And we were able to see that. That's also in the article I know Allison's kind of sharing with everyone. So I think the idea of you don't have to just go sign up to spend like $100 million across like demand generation. Like there is a way, I think, to kind of start to test into it and show why it matters.
The one thing just real quick I would add is I try to always emphasize just to make sure to put sort of marketing and the brand building in the right context of like the whole aspect of everything that's transpiring, be it your pricing, your distribution, your merchandising. All these sorts of things are sort of foundational, and you can't exclude them. We can't kind of treat marketing out here and then have these other issues underlying. And so I think it all sort of works hand in hand. And so I think ultimately just making sure that as you're having these conversations about what's the right level of spend, you sort of keep that whole picture of sort of what are all the different touch points that consumers or your consumers are actually coming in contact, because they all are vehicles to ultimately drive your ultimate outcome, be it short term or long term.
Yeah, and Corey, I think I'm going to put you on the spot here to bring us home. So one of the other questions we got is, are there some brands, depending on the sales cycle, that have like is short-termism a bigger problem with, ice cream or body wash brands than, for example, major appliances or autos? So I guess the question to you is like, do you think culturally in your organization, you're kind of fighting for brand Or do you think there's more natural gravitation because of the type of, sales cycle?
Honestly, coming from CPG and then moving into durables category, I think there's more inclination to accept sort of the longer term kind of investment choices and things like that. And so maybe it is a bit more pushing more to the understanding of the connections to the short term sort of measures. So I would say I don't know if it's sort of across the board, but at least from my experience, it seems like it's sort of more acceptable, I guess, to sort of use some of these longer term metrics as opposed to being forced or pushed into all in on sort of the shorter term metrics.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And we are at time. So thank you to all of you for your great insights. Hopefully our attendees got a lot out of this. And the articles are linked up in the chat for those of you still here. And that's a wrap.